Welcome to the laws of cooking on Shabbat. This is going to be part 10 of the class. Today's topic is adding a raw piece of meat. What is going to be the halacha if a woman went ahead and she placed a raw piece of meat into a kli rishon which is on the fire, or if she went ahead and she placed a raw piece of meat into a kli rishon which is off the fire? Now, what's a kli rishon, Rabotai? As we're going to go along, we're going to start learning new terminologies. Kli rishon she'al ha'esh. This pot over here is called a kli rishon. Kli literally means utensil. Rishon literally means the first. This is the first utensil. As we're going to start learning halachot Shabbat, when we get a little bit into it, we're going to start understanding that there is a kli rishon, which is the first utensil. Kli sheni, which is the second utensil. Kli shlishi, which is the third utensil. As we go along, we're going to understand why we need to know these terminologies. But as of now, for today, we have to understand this pot over here is called kli rishon, which is the first utensil, al ha'esh, which is on top of the fire. Now, if a woman went ahead and she put meat into this pot of food on Shabbat, the halakha is going to be very different if she went and she placed it into this pot of food on Shabbat, which is off the fire. Now, this is also kli rishon, but it's off the fire. Now, you might ask me a question, Rabbi, what is the difference between this pot and this pot? Why are they both called kli rishon? Now, you have to understand, when I remove this pot of food from the fire, it's still hot. So just because it's not on the fire doesn't mean it does not have the power to cook. It still can cook. So whether you have the pot on the fire, which is going to do that job through cooking, or whether you took off the pot from the fire and now you put the piece of meat into the food, it still could cook because it's still hot. But Rabotai, halachically there are different excuse me. Halachically there are different laws when it comes to a kli rishon which is on the fire versus a kli rishon which is off the fire. As we're going to see be'ezrat Hashem. So just remember, this is a kli rishon off the fire. This is a kli rishon on the fire, and the halachot do vary. So Rav David Yosef Shlita in the Sefer Halacha Birura begins. V'im usifu hatichat basar chai. If a person went ahead and they added a raw piece of meat l'toch tavshil shebikli rishon she'eno al ha'esh, if you went ahead and you added a raw piece of meat into a cooked dish, which is a kli rishon, which is not on the fire, this case, mutar le'echol et hatavshil b'Shabbat. You are allowed to go ahead and you're allowed to consume that food on Shabbat. Even that piece, even that raw piece of meat that you went ahead and you placed it into the kli rishon, which is off the fire, is going to be permissible for you to consume it on Shabbat. But remember, you're not allowed to do it. But if you did do it, we're going to tell you the food itself is allowed to be consumed, and also that raw piece of meat is allowed to be consumed. What happens if you went ahead and you added a raw piece of meat into a cooked dish, which is the kli rishon, which is on the fire? This case, very important, and that chaticha, that piece of meat was cooked. Asur le'echol et ota chaticha b'Shabbat. You're not allowed to eat that piece of meat on Shabbat. What happens if the person knowingly, intentionally knew that it was not allowed to be done and he still went ahead and he did it, that piece of meat could never be eaten by that person that went ahead and he put it into the cooked dish, which is on the fire on Shabbat. He could never eat it. Not on Shabbat, not after Shabbat, never ever. But everyone else is going to be allowed to eat it after Shabbat is over. But nobody's allowed to eat that piece of meat on Shabbat itself. Like we wrote above, in the beginning of the Siman, we spoke about these halachot. So, one more time, Rabotai. What does Rav David Yosef Shultat telling us over here? That if a person went ahead, if a person added a raw piece of meat into a cooked dish, which is a kli rishon, which is on the fire, and the cooked, and that raw meat became cooked, you're not allowed to eat that piece of meat on Shabbat. And we explained, for that person, he's never allowed to eat it. For everyone else, they're allowed to eat it immediately after Shabbat is out. What about the food itself? Aval, however, the food itself is going to be permissible for one to eat it on Shabbat, as long as you had over there majority against this raw piece of meat. So it comes out over here that if a woman went ahead and she placed a steak or, I don't know, a few pieces of meat into, let's say, chulin, for example, because she wanted to give more taste, which was not allowed to be done, we're going to tell you that meat, nobody's allowed to have it on Shabbat. After Shabbat, she's never allowed to have it, but everyone else is allowed to eat it. But the chulent itself on Shabbat, you're allowed to consume that chulent as long as you have majority against these few pieces of meat that she placed in. ואם נתערבה אותה חתיכה בחתיכות אחרת באופן שאי אפשר לדעת איזה חתיכה נתנו בתבשל בשבת. What happens if that piece of raw meat which got cooked was mixed up with other pieces of meat where I can't tell which piece was the one that was cooked on Shabbat? What are we going to tell you? Mutorot kol hachatichot b'achila b'Shabbat. All the pieces are allowed to be eaten on Shabbat. So it comes out over here that, let's say the son realized that what the mother did was wrong. Eventually, he says, I know I'm allowed to eat the chulent because there's majority against the pieces of meat. What did the son do? He removed the pieces of meat and he put it on the plate. Now, the chulent you're allowed to eat. The pieces of meat you're not allowed to eat. Came the sister, she took the piece of meat, not realizing that that was inside the chulent. She came and she took it and she placed it with other pieces of meat. Now, the brother looks back, he says, 1 second, where does the meat go? She says, I put it over there on the plate. Which ones? We don't know. You don't know, you're allowed to go ahead and consume it. Okay, review. If someone puts a piece of raw meat into a hot pot, which is a kli rishon, but now it's off the fire, it's okay. Not that it's okay to do it, you're allowed to consume the food. The food can be eaten on Shabbat. The food can be eaten on Shabbat, and even that piece of meat can be eaten on Shabbat. But if the raw meat was put in when the pot was still on the fire, and the meat got cooked, very important, then that piece of meat cannot be eaten on Shabbat. If it was done on purpose, that piece of meat is forbidden to that person forever, and to everyone else permitted after Shabbat is over. But the food itself is still allowed to be eaten as long as there is more food than the one piece of meat. Majority cancels it. If that cooked piece of meat got mixed up with other pieces, so you can tell which is which, then all pieces are allowed to be eaten on Shabbat. Rabotai, have a great day. Baruch